Hello, I'm Deborah Malone, founder of The Internationalist and host of Internationalist Marketing TV. Today's guest is Tim Love, author of Discovering Truth: How to Navigate Between Fact and Fiction in an Overwhelming Social Media World. Tim, it is always a pleasure to see you, and this is another milestone for you in your career because you've accomplished something that few people do, and that's to work with a lot of well-known people on a subject that is creating tremendous debate in all circles. But let me at least properly introduce you to the show and welcome you to the show.
Well, thank you very much. I'm happy to be talking with you today.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, look, let me just begin with some quick questions. And at the crux of the book are these amazing contributors. I realize you had some initial podcast conversations with them, which evolved into this amazing, amazing book. Now, many of these people were marketing colleagues. Others have interesting roles in the world at large. Were you surprised that so many people were willing to comment on the process of discovering truth in a social media world?
Yes, to put a bracket around that, I started with a podcast that led to a second podcast that then turned into a commitment for 15 episodes that ended up being 47 because people contacted me and said, I'd like to participate in this discussion.
Well, that's it obviously shows that you were touching a nerve. Now, before I talk about some of the individual contributors, I thought it very interesting how you ordered these conversations and these chapters to create a flow, an amazing flow of very distinct ideas. Because I actually found that the progression of chapters worked well in constantly building on prior knowledge. Would you just tell us a little bit about that process?
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'm going to just look at the table of contents because it will remind myself. Um, the first thing is that I put it in. They weren't in the order of the 47 podcasts, and I used 21 of the individuals that I talked with. I did not use all 47 episodes, but those episodes are in the book with QR codes so people can easily link up with them. I felt the beginning of this story needed to have some background, historical background about truth and its role in society and so forth. And so the first section really deals with aspects of the history, background, media, about consumers today. And it's a primer, really, the first section. And then the second section was really kind of some input from people that aren't necessarily in the advertising business, but are very tied in with the issue of misinformation and particularly in social issues. Thought that was important. And finally, I included at the end some testimony from some people who speak about leadership and truth. And these were notable people like Jane Goodall and John Pepper, the former chairman of P&G and the Walt Disney Company. And so there is a link, obviously, to leadership and truth. And that's kind of the flow I went through. And the more I stuck with it, the more it seemed to work.
Well, it's interesting. You made note of a number of people just now with John Pepper and Jane Goodall, but each of your contributors had quite a unique perspective on truth, as you've just mentioned, in terms of this journey. Would you just start with some of the people in advertising and marketing? I know that many were colleagues. Maybe tell us a little bit about why you chose them, and
Okay.
give us a little background on them, and then I'll ask you about some of the people that aren't in the industry.
Okay. I'm going to try not to go. I could talk for hours about these people. They were wonderful people. And one thing I might say to start with that I was thinking is that this book is very unusual because it's a discussion of truth, but it's the first book that I've ever heard of that actually discusses what people say and offers the reader the immediate opportunity to go listen for themselves. They don't need to rely on the verbiage in the book. They can go right away. And that was what the publishing company, you, suggested. And it's pretty novel. I think it's going to become something that every book, instead of giving a link, will start giving QR codes so that people can immediately check the truth of what they're reading. And I think that's my hat's off to you for suggesting that. A lot of people have commented on that to me. They like that. They say, I haven't listened to the podcast yet, but I'm going to. And for that reason, I think there's a transparency that comes across that is unusual. Some of the people I picked that I would like to sing aloud, obviously, I've mentioned Jane Goodall. Her work as a primatologist is legendary, and her work as an ambassador, UN ambassador for peace and hope, is a lifelong evidence of her commitment to truth and helping make the world a better place. John Pepper's one of the greatest leaders of business over the last 50 years. He led the Procter & Gamble Company and also was non-executive chairman of the Walt Disney Company. So his perspectives on communication, marketing, persuasion, and consumers is about as substantial as you can get. Paul Polman, who is the CEO of Unilever and who was born in Holland, it brings a real global perspective to his views on truth, and in particular on the climate change arguments, which he's very intimately involved in when he was at Unilever, but also at the United Nations. Joe Plummer, who was head of the Advertising Research Foundation and is a noted strategic planner in the advertising and marketing business, and an adjunct professor at Columbia, provides a very interesting point of view on consumers today and the different age groups and how they differ and how this differs from 20, 30 years ago. Evan Shapiro is a media expert who has had experience in television, cable, movie industry. He's a professor at NYU and Fordham, and he gives a perspective on what's going on in media today, which is so fundamental to the book, because my book is basically saying that if you watch how we communicate with each other and you study the effect of how we do that, it actually affects people's perceptions and how they arrive at truth. Carla Michelotti does a chapter on the legal implications that I think a lot of people are hearing about and reading about in terms of social media platforms and the internet. Carla set up the first meeting of the internet with the White House in the 1990s. And the first question they asked of her in the advertising industry is, what are you guys doing here? Because they didn't anticipate that it would be an advertisable medium. Well, it's certainly changed, hasn't it? And Carla has the legal perspective on that is superior to anybody I've met in the communications business. So those are just a few of the people. Jeffrey Rayport, a leading professor from Harvard Business School, makes a tremendous contribution. He's the guy that came up with coined the phrase viral marketing. So and he did that many years ago. So it's a formidable group, and I think people find it interesting to read about them.
Yes, a formidable group and quite a diverse group, which I think is interesting when you're talking about an issue like discovering truth
Yeah,
and changing opinions.
I should have mentioned Dr. Linda Scott, who is a noted authority from Oxford University in England. She's written a book called The Double X Economy that really specifically lays out the economic impact of women's empowerment. And it's a leading seller now. And I'd also like to mention Lincoln Stevens, who runs the Marcus Graham Project, which is a wonderful program to encourage diversity and role model in business for diverse people.
Well, what out of this group, which obviously is a big group, a lot of different opinions, and I think the mastery of the book is in the progression of those opinions and threading them together. But there must have been some surprises that you encountered when interviewing these people. Can you share any with us?
Yeah, I would say overall, the overall surprise was the iterative surprises that I got as I did the podcast series, because what we were talking about was becoming more and more prevalent in public discourse. I found people more and more interested. And one of the biggest surprises that we had was in one of the earliest podcasts when I was talking with Mr. Will Platt Higgins from Facebook. First of all, it was unusual to be able to get somebody from Facebook to come talk to us about this subject, because they were appearing on Congress at different hearings at the time, and for him to come and talk to me about this issue was quite an achievement. But during the conversation, which I had with Will, and you can hear this on the podcast yourself, is he volunteered at one point to alert me and our listeners to the fact that Facebook knew that their platform was being used by was being weaponized by foreign entities, and specifically the whole Cambridge Analytica and the information coming in from Russia. And I remember that later I heard that the people in the sound studios' mouths dropped, because the debate that was going on in America at the time was Russia really involved in the election or not? Well, I didn't even ask him. He offered and said that they could tell it. And I said, you mean, where the information's coming from? And he said, yeah, we can track it. And I thought, why aren't we asking the social media platforms where this information's coming from? And it validated an initial thesis that I had right from the beginning, which was that misinformation is being used to polarize our country. And it's being used on both sides, on multiple sides of race, politics, economics. And if you study what Russia, for one example, has articulated in their long-term plans, this current social media environment that we live in America is an ideal scenario for them to activate the plans of destabilizing our country that they've often talked about. And that isn't that no longer became a conspiracy theory when Facebook volunteered that they knew that the information was coming from the research advertising company in St. Petersburg, Russia.
Well, I'm sure that there's even been a lot more
Yes, there has.
events since that particular incident, and
Yes. Well, the
I
Coalition for a Safer Web is monitoring this, and that's an important chapter in the book with their artificial intelligence, anticipatory intelligence technique that they're using. And by the way, they are working with Facebook now.
Oh, very, very interesting. So already we're seeing some of the positive effects
Yes.
of these conversations, which is one of the things that I did want to ask you about. But let me go back to another basic. Um, it is a very big book, but people may not realize that the book is actually in two parts. There is the discovery of truth portion that's predicated on the podcast interviews that you had with these notable people and how they have helped explain a journey of how
Mhm.
one might best
Mhm.
navigate fact and fiction. But then you also have a very personal portion. And it really is the memoirs of someone who spent a career in advertising, marketing, and communications. Could you talk about the motivation you had for setting up the book this way?
Well, when you take on a subject like truth, people expect, well, their defense mechanisms go up and they expect that you're going to try and tell them what truth is. And I never thought that that was my role. What I was trying to, I also had to come to grips with, why do I think I have anything of value to add to this subject? And the only real area that that I think where I can legitimately add value to this is from my experience in persuasion through marketing communications and a life spent studying the media and studying marketing communications with some of the world's largest clients in every culture you can name on the planet. Um, I can with confidence talk about truth from the vantage point of advertising, for example, where I learned very, very early on that, contrary to what many may think, the most fundamental aspect of good advertising is truth, because you're inviting people to embrace your brand, your company. And if what you say isn't true, they'll penalize you. And in the social media world, they won't just penalize you by not buying or sending you a letter. They'll tell all of their friends. So you had better be telling the truth about what you're saying. And because of that, I felt that I could examine this issue of misinformation, fake news, things that troubled me, that were being said about journalism, and from my area of expertise. And that's why I chose people from the marketing communications industry, because their whole lives have been spent understanding consumers and how they process um, truth. Um, and I also realized that my own perception of truth and how I arrived at truth was weaving through my brain through this whole 6-year process, which started with a lecture at Ave Maria University. And I had this initial intuition that truth is not a fact or what someone says. It's a decision. It's a decision made in the face of conflicting information, where we must balance our natural curiosity for novel content. We all crave novel content. And boy, in advertising, that's why we said new improves so often, against the forces of our own confirmation biases and what other people's opinions are. And when you're looking at between 4,000 to 10,000 bits of information a day, which is what the average person sees as they drive down the road, they go to the grocery store, they watch media, or they do social media. It's a load. to try and make a decision with. But that's what truth is. It's the decision you make. The second thing that I learned that surprised me was that this idea of commitment, consistency. Once we make decisions, we human beings have a tendency to try and reaffirm those decisions rather than seek or even entertain any information that would make them rethink the decision. And that is a huge weapon that can be used to persuade people and to misguide people. And it's being done today.
It's interesting that you use the term new and improved in terms of our craving, novel content. It also reminds me of so many other advertising elements, and I think that was the wonderful part of the memoir, in that it almost holds up a mirror to the other part of discovering the truth process, because you were willing to be vulnerable enough to say, well, this is what I thought when I was young, and now I've evolved. And I think that an evolution in understanding is really so much about what this book is about. And as I think I've actually said before, that I love seeing so much of the historical roots, because I think when you live through something, you're not always aware of how things are always changing. I have a question for you, which it takes its roots in the book, but may go a little wider. We've talked a little bit about misinformation on social media. What do you believe are the good aspects of social media, or should we read the book to find out for ourselves?
Well, there's hours to talk about. I'm a big believer in social media. I'm a big believer in the evolution of media from the time of the printed word and Gutenberg's press. And I've been a student of media, and I might add that I grew up in a family. My dad was a television repairman and ran his business out of our home, so we had TVs going on in every room. It was, I grew up, and every new technology that came along, we kind of got first. So I've had this unusual interest in observing media and how it affects people. I came to a conclusion last night as I went through the book again, just to refresh my memory, that somebody talked about how I think it was Gutenberg himself, or no, it was Martin Luther, said something about the effect of the printed word, and how it led to enabling people to have more knowledge. And he called it a gift from God, which was interesting, that the Gutenberg press being a gift from God. And I believe that social media you could say the same thing about social media, because it's enabled us to communicate as we're communicating here today during COVID, where we're able to see each other. I will add one thing, that it is not the same as sitting together and having a conversation. Our brain, we know from neuroscience that our brains work very differently when we're face to face with somebody than when we are using FaceTime or Zoom or some other communication medium. We've also learned that how we communicate verbally uses different parts of the brain than how we communicate when we write, when we text, and when we type. And there's a considerable amount of learning that needs to be done in terms of persuasion and influence of what we've just been through with COVID, where we've shifted more of our communication to less personal and more technical, and where we've increased the use of texting and emailing. And uses a different part of the brain, and it impacts on our perception of truth very, very differently.
Oh, that is fascinating. Let me turn to a practical question. What would you like to see happen as a result of your work on discovering truth?
Well, initially, my hope was that it would be somewhat of a primer for media literacy, and I still think it will add value to that. And some of the professors that have reviewed it already have indicated great interest in it as a media literacy uh, volume. But as the news has progressed, and even the news of last night with the January 6th report coming out, I hope that it will make not allow us to forgive each other because of some of the opinions and positions that we've become so entrenched by in our families and with our friends. We need to forgive each other for some of those things and acknowledge that maybe we've been influenced by some things that misled us on all sides. If people could do that, then I think we could take this social media and make it something that the rest of the world can never duplicate because of our values and our character and our freedom in this country. You know, when Google went into China, they didn't like it, so they kicked it out and started their own Google. Russia has its own social media platforms, but the social media platforms that are most desired in the world come from an American point of view, and we just have to make sure that we protect those, that we don't allow them to be abused by malinformation. And that's no different than the beginning of the television era, the radio era, or the magazine era before that. The advertisers have to be more involved in creating self-regulation and oversight for social media, which basically there is none now. That's a problem. And there is none if you'll read Carla's chapter or her episode, you'll understand why there is no oversight. And it's because nobody thought that this would be an advertisable medium. They thought it would be like telephone service. And it's developed completely different.
Well, yeah, it's always amazing. Something starts out with one intention and goes in another direction. Well, on that note, what's next for you, Tim Love?
Oh, you're not the only one that's asking me that, because you're right about writing a book. It's been very consuming, and I've loved it because I've loved this subject, and I've loved the fact that it's aggregated and snowballed into different conversations, and I've had so many people offer to contribute. Actually, what I'm planning to do is a series of visual ideas on pickleball. I was an art major, and I've had this idea of doing something with the pickleball craze in my art. And there's an art exhibition in March that I'm going to point to. So more to be seen later, but I'm going to be painting some things that I think people will find humorous and fun in the pickleball area.
Well, I guess maybe as long as you stay out of the kitchen, maybe,
I learned what that is.
yep, maybe you can find truth in pickleball.
Well,
So,
I hope so.
let's hope so. All right, a pleasure to talk to you, and I'm sure that we'll be continuing these conversations.
Thank you very much, Deborah. Have a good day.
Thanks. The Internationalist focuses on the continual reinvention of marketing by highlighting inspirational marketers around the world and their ideas as they move the industry forward. Internationalist Marketing TV shares these perspectives through interviews and personal stories. Thanks so much for watching. If you find this kind of content helpful, please click like or subscribe. Again, thanks so much.